It was Halloween night, cold enough that every breath came out like smoke. The air smelled like damp leaves and burnt pumpkins from candles left too long inside them. I hadn't planned to do anything special that night. I wasn't into parties or dressing up, and I didn't have anyone to go with anyway. My street was mostly quiet, lined with small houses where the lights were already off by 9. The only thing moving outside were kids still running around in cheap costumes, their candy bags rustling as they disappeared into the next block. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in my living room, half watching a horror movie on TV, when I started hearing something faint outside. It wasn't loud, just this slow crunching sound that came and went. I thought maybe it was the wind pushing the leaves along the sidewalk. But after a few minutes, I noticed it had a rhythm to it, like footsteps. Slow, steady ones. I muted the TV and listened harder. The sound would stop for a while, then start again, always moving closer, then pausing. At first, I tried to ignore it. My house was at the end of the street, and there was a narrow alley that ran beside it, mostly used by kids cutting through during the day. But at night, that alley turned completely black since the streetlight on that side had gone out weeks ago. I thought maybe it was an animal, or some drunk guy taking a shortcut. Still, something about how slow those steps were made my stomach tighten a little. I got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look outside. The street was empty. The few porch lights still on gave off a soft orange glow that didn't reach far. I couldn't see anyone walking, but I could still hear the sound, crunch, pause, crunch. It was definitely coming from the side of my house now, from that alley. I stood there for a while, waiting to see a shadow move, but nothing did. I finally told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe someone dragging a garbage bag. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. After a few minutes, I turned off the TV and went to check the back door. It was locked, but I noticed something strange. My porch light in the back wasn't working. It had been fine earlier that week. When I flipped the switch a few times, it stayed dead. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I checked the front light too, and that one worked fine. Only the back one was out. I turned it off and went to the kitchen to get a drink of water, trying to act like I wasn't bothered, but my hands were shaking a little. I kept glancing toward the window above the sink, half expecting to see someone standing outside. After a few minutes, I went to the back window and looked out. The yard was pitch black. I could barely make out the fence. Then I noticed something. My trash bin, which I always kept right up against the fence, was moved. It was sitting almost in the middle of the yard. It wasn't like that when I came home from work. I stared at it for a long time, trying to come up with a reason. Maybe the wind? But it was heavy, full of trash. My heart started beating faster. I didn't want to go outside, but I also couldn't stop thinking about it. I finally decided to grab my flashlight and check it out quickly, just to calm myself down. I opened the back door slowly. The cold air hit me immediately. The smell of wet dirt and leaves was strong. I stepped outside, the light from the flashlight cutting through the dark in a thin beam. The ground was soft from yesterday's rain. As I walked closer to the bin, I noticed footprints in the mud. Not mine, these were bigger, wider, and fresh. They led from the alley to the trash bin, then back again. I followed them with the light, my breath getting shorter. They stopped right at the side of my fence where the alley began. I shined the light into the alley but couldn't see anything. The beam just faded into black. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds before I heard it again. The crunching sound, slow and heavy, this time from farther down the alley. I froze. It was like whoever or whatever was there had stopped when I came out, then started again as soon as I did. I didn't move. I just stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, waiting to see something. Then I saw it. Not clearly, but enough. Someone was standing halfway down the alley, barely visible between the shadows. I could only make out a shape, tall, wearing something dark, head slightly tilted. They weren't moving, just standing there facing me. I felt the back of my neck go numb. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to run back inside and show fear, but I also didn't want to stand there like an idiot. The person didn't move. I backed up slowly until I reached the door. I stepped inside and locked it, double-checked it twice, then shut off the light so I wouldn't be visible from outside. My heart was hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. I waited by the window, watching for movement. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard the sound again, closer this time, right outside the fence. That's when I called the police. I didn't care if I was overreacting. They said they'd send a patrol car. I stayed hidden behind the curtains until I saw the red and blue lights reflect off the walls. 2 officers walked around with flashlights for about 10 minutes. When they came to the door, they told me they didn't find anyone. Just footprints, but they said it could have been kids messing around. I nodded, but I knew from the way those steps sounded that it wasn't kids. Kids run, they don't move that slow. After they left, I couldn't sleep. I checked every door and window again. Around 3 a.m., I finally laid down on the couch, keeping the flashlight next to me. The rest of the night was quiet. The next morning, I went outside to check the yard in daylight. The footprints were still there, deep and clear. But what made my stomach twist was something else, a mark on my back door. It looked like a scratch, long and shallow, right near the handle. Not from an animal, from something metal. Maybe a screwdriver or a knife. That day, I installed new locks and bought motion lights for the backyard. I never saw the person again. But every Halloween since then, I can't help thinking about that sound. The slow, crunching footsteps and the shape in the alley. I always keep the lights on now and I don't open the door for anyone. The weirdest part? The police called me back 2 days later. They said a few houses down, someone's shed had been broken into that same night. The door was pried open and a few tools were missing. Whoever it was, they had been walking the neighborhood testing doors, looking for a place to get inside. I wasn't special. I was just one of the houses they tried. I got lucky because I locked mine early. Sometimes when I think about it, I realize how easily it could have gone the other way. That night wasn't about Halloween or costumes or anything supernatural. It was just a real person, out there in the dark, trying doors until they found one that opened, and that thought still scares me more than anything else ever has. It was Halloween night and the streets were filled with kids in costumes running from house to house. I wasn't part of that. I hadn't dressed up for Halloween in years. I wasn't into parties or decorations anymore. I just wanted to be left alone. I lived on the edge of town, in a small house that used to belong to my uncle. It sat behind a long dirt driveway surrounded by tall trees, so far back that no trick-or-treaters ever came by. That was the way I liked it. Earlier that day, I had gone into town to buy some groceries, and when I came back, I noticed something strange. A black car was parked a few hundred feet down from the entrance of my driveway. I figured maybe someone broke down or was waiting for someone. I didn't think much of it, but when I came out later that evening to grab the mail, the same car was still there. It was getting dark and the streetlight nearby flickered weakly. I could see the faint reflection of someone sitting inside, but I couldn't make out their face. I went back inside and tried to ignore it. I made myself some dinner, turned on the TV, and tried to focus on anything else. But I kept thinking about that car. I looked out the front window every so often, and the headlights were still faintly visible through the trees. By the time it got close to 9 p.m., I decided to close all the curtains and lock the doors. I told myself it was probably just someone parked there for the night or kids messing around. Still, something about it didn't sit right. A few hours later, I heard something outside, gravel crunching, slow and deliberate. My heart started racing immediately. I turned off the TV and stood still. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer this time. I moved quietly to the window and lifted the curtain just a bit. My porch light was on, and through the glare, I could see a shadow moving near the edge of the trees. It was just standing there watching my house. I could only make out the shape of a person, tall and motionless. I froze. My mind tried to reason with itself. Maybe it was just someone cutting through the property. Maybe they were lost. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became that they weren't moving away. They were just standing there staring. I backed away from the window and went to the kitchen to grab the biggest knife I had. The sound of gravel started again, this time moving slowly toward the front steps. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. Then silence. I waited, trying not to breathe too loudly. After what felt like minutes, I forced myself to look out again. The porch was empty. The person was gone, but the car was still out there. Its headlights were off now, completely dark. I stood there for a long time, gripping the knife, trying to decide whether to call someone or just wait it out. I didn't have any close neighbors and the police station was 15 minutes away. Then I heard a soft thud on the side of the house. It sounded like something bumping against the wall. Then another, and another. I slowly walked to the back door, keeping the lights off, and looked through the small window. The backyard was empty. The trees swayed in the wind, but nothing else moved. I checked the side window, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were wet footprints leading up to the window from the yard, bare feet, large, smeared with mud. They stopped just below the window where I was standing. I looked around but couldn't see anyone. The prints were fresh. My chest felt tight as I backed away. I started checking every door and window again, making sure everything was locked. I decided to go upstairs to my room. I figured if someone was outside, I'd have a better view from up there. I turned off all the lights so the inside wouldn't be visible. When I looked out from my bedroom window, I could see the driveway clearly. The car was still there, but now the driver's side door was open. I scanned the yard and saw movement near the back fence. A person slowly walking along it, almost crouched. They looked like they were searching for something. I couldn't see any details, just the dark shape of someone creeping along the edge of my property. At that point, I thought about running out the front door and driving off. But my truck keys were downstairs and every instinct told me not to move. I kept watching from the window. After a few minutes, the figure disappeared into the trees. I waited and waited, but they never came back into view. Eventually, I sat on the floor against the wall, still holding the knife. I must have stayed like that for hours. Sometime after 2 a.m., exhaustion hit me and I dozed off. When I woke up, it was around 6 a.m. The light from the sun was starting to seep through the curtains. Everything was quiet. I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs. I unlocked the front door and stepped outside. The car was gone. The driveway looked normal again. But when I walked toward the side of the house, I saw something that made me stop cold. There were more muddy footprints, dozens of them all around the house. Some led to my back door, some to the windows. And near the porch steps, I found a torn piece of cloth, dark gray, caught on a nail. When I followed the prints a little further, I saw that they led into the woods behind the house. I could see a trail of disturbed leaves and dirt heading deep into the trees. It looked like someone had been moving around out there for a long time, maybe circling the house. I decided to call the sheriff's office. They came by later that morning and walked around with me. They didn't find much, just the footprints, the torn cloth, and some empty food wrappers near the tree line. The deputy told me it was probably some drifter or someone camping out in the woods. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't sure either. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about how long that person might have been out there. How many nights before Halloween they'd been watching. Maybe they had been living in the woods near my house for days, waiting for the right time. Maybe they were still out there, just deeper in the trees, watching again. Since that night, I haven't spent another Halloween alone. Every time October comes around, I start hearing small things again. Gravel crunching, leaves rustling outside my window, faint footsteps when I'm trying to sleep. I tell myself it's just the wind or animals moving through the woods. But every Halloween night, without fail, I see the same thing at the edge of the driveway. A dark car. No lights, engine off, just sitting there watching. It was late October, a few nights before Halloween, and I had agreed to house sit for a coworker who lived on the edge of town. His place was in a quiet neighborhood where most houses looked the same. Narrow front lawns, half-dead trees, porches with plastic skeletons and pumpkins scattered around. I didn't really celebrate Halloween, but I didn't mind the job. He offered me a couple $100 to stay for the weekend, feed his dog, and make sure no kids messed with his decorations. It seemed easy enough. When I first got there, it was just turning dark. The air had that sharp, cold bite that always hits at the end of October. The house felt still inside, like nobody had lived there for a while, even though it was clean. His dog, an older black lab, followed me everywhere, quiet but alert. I noticed she kept sniffing at the back door. then staring at the curtain like she was waiting for someone to walk past it. I figured she was just used to her owner coming home at that time of day, so I didn't think much of it. After I unpacked my stuff and microwaved some leftovers I'd brought, I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone. The house was unusually quiet. No cars driving by, no kids outside, no voices from neighbors. It felt like the whole street had shut down. Every now and then I'd hear small cracks from the wood floors or a faint ticking sound from the walls. Probably pipes. But when the dog suddenly lifted her head and stared toward the window, I froze. There were footsteps outside on the gravel driveway. Slow, uneven ones. I muted the TV and listened. They came closer, stopped, then started again. When I looked out the window, I saw nothing. No car, no person, nothing moving. I went to the front door and checked that it was locked, then made sure the back door was too. It was. Around midnight, I decided to sleep on the couch since the house felt warmer there. The dog lay beside me, head on her paws, still facing the back of the house. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of the door handle rattling. It was soft at first, like someone testing it, then it stopped. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to hear anything else. A few seconds later, the dog growled quietly, a deep sound I could feel through the floor. Then something brushed against the window behind the curtain. A dragging sound, like a sleeve or a hand scraping along the glass. I sat up slowly and looked, but the outside was pitch black. I waited for maybe 5 minutes before the noise stopped. The dog didn't settle down for a long time, and neither did I. When I finally drifted off, I had this heavy feeling that someone had been standing just outside the house, watching. The next morning, I checked around the house. In the dirt near the side of the driveway, I found footprints. They were uneven, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one foot. They led up to the back steps, then back toward the road. They looked fresh, like from the night before. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick-or-treater or a drunk neighbor, but it didn't feel right. That night, I kept most of the lights off and sat near the front window where I could see the street. Around 11, I saw movement down the road. Someone walking slowly, wearing a dark jacket, hood pulled up. They weren't carrying anything, not even a flashlight, and they weren't wearing a costume. They stopped in front of a house a few doors down and just stood there for a long time, facing the yard. After maybe 5 minutes, they moved again, heading toward the next house, doing the same thing. When they got to the one across from me, I ducked slightly so I could see without being seen. The figure stood at the edge of the yard, just looking toward the porch, not moving. Then they turned their head in my direction. I pulled back from the window fast. I didn't know if they could see me through the curtain, but I suddenly felt completely exposed. After a while, I looked again and they were gone. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made my heart jump. The fridge kicking on, the wind pushing against the siding, branches scraping the roof. Around 3 a.m., I heard the back gate squeak open. I grabbed the flashlight and the dog followed close behind me. I stayed inside but peeked through the glass of the back door. The motion light had turned on, and I could see the gate swinging slowly. No one was there. When morning came, I saw more footprints. They went all the way around the house this time. The ground near the back window looked disturbed, like someone had stood there for a while. The dog's water bowl outside had been tipped over. I called my coworker and told him about it, and he said maybe it was a local teenager playing pranks before Halloween. That made sense, but something still felt off about it. By the third night, I was running on barely any sleep. I left some lights on and sat up again, waiting. It was quiet for most of the night. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard the creak of the back steps. Not footsteps this time. Just the wood shifting like someone had put weight on it and stayed there. The dog started growling low again, staring at the door. My stomach felt hollow. I turned off the light and stood by the kitchen counter watching the door. The sound didn't stop. It was like whoever was there was waiting for me to react. I took a few slow steps toward the door and then saw the doorknob twitch slightly. My heart felt like it stopped. I didn't move. The knob turned once more, very slow, then let go. After that, there was silence. When I looked out the next morning, the footprints were back, this time deeper, pressed into the mud from the rain. They went toward the side fence, then stopped. I followed them out into the yard and noticed that one of the fence panels had been pulled loose from the bottom. Someone had been getting in from there. That was the last night I stayed there. I called my coworker and told him I wasn't comfortable watching the house anymore. When I left, I drove slow through the neighborhood, checking the sidewalks. A few houses had Halloween decorations, fake tombstones, skeletons, cobwebs, but what caught my eye was a small figure standing near the trees at the end of the street. A man, or maybe a teenager, wearing the same dark jacket and hood, just standing there facing my coworker's house. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. A few weeks later, after Halloween was over, my coworker came back to work. He told me something strange had happened the day after I left. He found the side gate wide open and his back door scratched up, like someone had tried prying it open with something metal. Nothing was stolen, but his dog wouldn't go near the back of the house anymore. Even now, when I think about that weekend, it doesn't feel like a prank. Whoever was coming around wasn't doing it for fun. They were watching, waiting, checking the doors every night to see if someone had finally forgotten to lock one. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, I still think about those slow footsteps outside on the gravel and the sound of that doorknob turning in the dark. I've never stayed in anyone's house again since then. Not during Halloween, not ever. It was Halloween night, cold and strangely quiet for a small suburban neighborhood. I wasn't planning to do anything special that night. I didn't go to parties anymore, and I wasn't in the mood for trick-or-treaters. I lived alone in a small single-story house on a dead-end street that backed into a narrow strip of woods. Most people around here either went to the city for Halloween events or stayed in, so I expected a quiet night. I had stocked up on snacks and planned to watch a few horror movies before heading to bed early. Around 6, I noticed the sky getting dark faster than usual. The wind was still, but the air felt heavy, like rain was about to fall even though there were no clouds thick enough for it. I shut my blinds halfway and left the porch light off, hoping kids would skip my house. I could already hear faint laughter and footsteps outside from groups walking past, but it died down pretty quickly after a while. By 7:30, the street was mostly empty. The silence after all that brief noise made the house feel unnaturally still. I microwaved some food and sat down in the living room. The TV glow filled the room with dull blue light. Every so often, I thought I heard something small hit the window, maybe a bug or a leaf, but when I muted the movie to check, there was nothing. Around 9, I started noticing that faint sound again, a light tapping, but it wasn't random anymore. It came in slow, steady beats, almost like someone was knocking softly. Not on the door, but on the back window. I froze where I was, listening. My house had one large sliding glass door at the back that led to a small patio. Beyond that, there were maybe 30 yards of grass and then the start of the woods. I kept the blinds there completely shut. The tapping continued. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Then again, the same pattern. It was too deliberate to be the wind. I stood up, heart thudding, and turned off the TV. The sudden quiet made every small sound sharper. I went to the kitchen and peeked through the side window that looked toward the backyard. But all I could see was my reflection against the glass. The motion sensor light out back didn't turn on, which meant nothing had crossed its path. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it could have been a branch hitting the glass from the wind. I sat back down, but my body wouldn't relax. It came again, louder this time. 4 distinct knocks, then silence. I felt my stomach twist. I slowly stood up, walked back into the kitchen, and reached for the small flashlight I kept in a drawer. My hand was shaking slightly. I moved toward the back door, keeping the blinds closed. I listened with my ear against the glass. Nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. I decided to pull the blinds slightly to the side, just an inch, enough to peek through. The backyard was empty. The motion light finally clicked on, bathing the yard in harsh white light. The grass looked wet even though it hadn't rained. The woods were just a solid wall of black. No one there. I stood there staring for maybe 30 seconds before letting the blinds fall back. I turned away, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that maybe a neighbor kid was playing a prank. I went back to the living room and turned on the TV again, just for some background noise. I sat still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My ears were tuned for every creak, every small sound. 10 minutes later, there was a new sound. A faint metallic rattle, like something brushing against the side gate that led to my backyard. It wasn't loud, but it was long and dragging, like someone's hand sliding across the chain link. My pulse jumped. I muted the TV again. The sound stopped as soon as I did. I stayed frozen for a while before slowly getting up and walking toward the kitchen again. I looked at the clock, 9:47 p.m. My backyard gate always stayed latched but not locked. It opened to the narrow wooded path behind the houses. If someone had slipped in through there, I wouldn't have seen them. I grabbed my phone and turned on its flashlight this time. I unlocked the back door quietly and opened it a crack. The cold air rushed in. The night smelled damp and earthy. I stepped out onto the patio, holding the light low so it wouldn't reflect back in my eyes. The yard looked normal at first glance. Then I noticed something near the far edge. Small shoe prints in the grass, darker from being wet. They were spaced out, as if someone had been walking slowly toward the house. I followed them with my light. They stopped halfway to the woods, right where the motion sensor range ended. The grass beyond that point was flattened in one spot, like someone had been crouching there. I scanned the trees, moving the light back and forth. My throat felt dry. I didn't see anyone, but I suddenly felt completely exposed standing out there. I turned back toward the house and noticed something small hanging from the edge of the patio door. A piece of orange fabric, torn, caught on the corner of the handle. It looked like part of a Halloween costume. I went back inside and locked the door, sliding the deadbolt tight. I pulled the blinds fully shut. I checked the front door and windows too, making sure everything was locked. My chest felt tight and I couldn't stop looking toward the hallway that led to the back rooms. I turned on more lights in the house, just to feel less boxed in by the dark. When I finally sat back down, I realized I hadn't eaten my food. It was cold and untouched. I stared at it without appetite. Around 10:30, I started hearing something again. Soft shuffling sounds, but this time they were inside. Faint, careful steps across the floor. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like the sound a person makes when trying not to be heard. The sound was coming from the hallway that led to the spare bedroom. My mind immediately tried to explain it away. Maybe the house settling, maybe the pipes. But I knew the difference. I knew that rhythm. I stood completely still, barely breathing. The steps stopped. Then I heard a slow creak, like a floorboard underweight. My whole body went cold. The only way someone could be in that hallway was if they'd already been inside before I locked everything. My chest started to tighten so hard I could barely breathe. I grabbed the flashlight again and moved slowly toward the hall. The air back there felt different, colder, heavier. I reached the end of the hall and shined the light into the spare room. The door was half open. The bed in there had some boxes stacked on it. Old stuff I hadn't touched in months. Nothing looked out of place at first. Then I noticed the closet door was slightly ajar. It had been shut earlier that day. I could see the faint edge of darkness inside. I didn't move for a long time. My legs felt like they'd lock up if I tried. I aimed the light directly at the gap, but I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of hanging coats. I stood there listening, waiting for any movement, any sound. There was nothing. Finally, I stepped forward, reached for the closet handle, and yanked it open all the way. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I scanned inside. It was empty, just storage boxes and clothes. I stood there for maybe a minute, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. I backed away slowly, feeling drained, then went to the front of the house and sat on the couch with the flashlight in my lap. I left all the lights on that night. I didn't hear anything else until morning. When I stepped outside after sunrise, the grass in the backyard had deep footprints leading back toward the woods. The latch on the gate was hanging open. Someone had been there, not something, not a sound in my head, but an actual person. I followed the prints only a few steps before they disappeared into the trees. Later that afternoon, I nailed the gate shut and ordered a camera system online. I haven't spent another Halloween alone since. But even now, sometimes when the nights get quiet and the wind stops completely, I swear I can still hear those slow, deliberate knocks on the glass. And every time I do, I can't help but wonder how long that person had been inside my house before I realized they were there. It was Halloween night when I decided to take a drive out to the edge of town. I had spent most of the day alone, watching people post photos of their costumes online, hearing distant laughter from kids walking around with plastic pumpkin buckets, and just feeling like I didn't fit anywhere that night. I wasn't in the mood for parties or crowds, so I took my car and headed out to clear my head. The sky was dull, no moon, just heavy clouds hanging low over the streets. Most of the houses were lit with orange lights and fake cobwebs, but as I kept driving farther, the decorations disappeared, and the streets went dark. I didn't really have a destination in mind. I just followed the empty road that led past a stretch of woods on the outskirts of town. The road there always made me uneasy. No streetlights, no houses, just black trees on both sides leaning inward like they were closing in on the asphalt. The only sound came from my tires and the faint hum of the engine. It was the kind of silence that made your own breathing sound loud. I noticed a faint orange glow ahead and thought it might be a bonfire or someone's Halloween setup. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old single-story house with a long driveway that looked abandoned. The porch light was flickering and the windows were covered in grime. There was no car in the driveway. No sign of anyone around, but there was a carved pumpkin still lit near the front steps. I slowed down and stopped by the side of the road, staring at it. Something about it felt strange. The pumpkin was too perfect, too fresh, like someone had just carved it minutes ago. The rest of the house looked untouched for years. I don't even know why, but I got out of my car. Maybe curiosity. Maybe I just wanted to see if someone actually lived there. The air was colder than I expected, sharp enough to sting my nose. I walked through the tall grass that brushed against my jeans and crunched under my shoes. When I got close to the porch, the smell hit me, something rotten mixed with burnt wax. The pumpkin's light flickered like it was about to go out. The door was slightly open, not wide, just cracked enough to see darkness inside. I stood there for a few seconds listening. There was no wind, no animals, just complete stillness. I pushed the door a little and it made a long, slow creak. The inside smelled worse, like mold and wet wood. I could barely see anything, but when my eyes adjusted, I noticed piles of junk scattered everywhere. Broken furniture, torn newspapers, and old Halloween decorations covered in dust. I took a step inside, and the floor felt soft under my boots, almost like it was rotting underneath. The wallpaper was peeling off, and there were faded black stains on the floor near the hallway. I pulled my phone out and turned on the flashlight. The beam caught what looked like muddy footprints leading from the front door toward the back of the house. They were fresh. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone around. My car was the only one on the road. The footprints looked like they belonged to bare feet, long toes pressed deep into the soft dirt. My chest started to tighten and my mouth felt dry. I wanted to turn around and leave, but I kept thinking maybe someone was squatting there, maybe a drunk or a homeless person who needed help. I followed the prints slowly, careful not to make much noise. The hallway led to a small kitchen. The ceiling had water damage, and there was a hole where light from my phone shined through. The refrigerator door was open and empty, rusted inside. On the table was a pile of melted candle wax with burnt matches stuck in it. The smell was stronger there, like spoiled meat. I looked at the floor and saw more footprints, this time heading toward a narrow door at the corner of the kitchen. It looked like it led to a basement. Something in me said to leave, but another part of me just wanted to see what was down there, like I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it if I didn't. I went to the door and noticed a heavy lock hanging broken on the latch. The handle was cold when I touched it. I pulled it open slowly and the smell hit harder, thick, sour, and heavy. The light from my phone barely reached the bottom of the stairs. The basement was colder, the air wet and stale. My boots made soft sounds on the wooden steps, and I could hear faint dripping somewhere deeper inside. When I reached the bottom, I saw a small table with a lantern on it, still warm like it had just been turned off. That made my stomach twist. Someone had been there very recently. There were shelves lined with jars full of cloudy liquid and what looked like bits of cloth floating inside. A mattress sat in the corner, filthy and dark-stained. On the wall above it, there were scratch marks, deep ones like someone had clawed at the plaster. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking a bit in my hand, and that's when I noticed something under the stairs. It was a duffel bag, half zipped, filled with what looked like clothes. When I crouched closer, I saw they were dirty, ripped, and some had dried brown stains. Inside one pocket was an ID card, a woman's driver's license from another state. I felt a cold rush go down my spine. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. I took a step back and the floor creaked loudly under me. Then I heard a sound and faint, slow footsteps from above. Someone was moving on the main floor, right above where I was standing. I turned off my flashlight instantly and crouched behind the shelves. The footsteps were careful, deliberate, moving toward the kitchen door. It felt like forever as I crouched there in the dark, barely breathing, listening to whoever it was walking slowly across the floor. I could hear them stop right above the basement stairs. Then the light from the doorway flickered. I heard the first step creak. Whoever it was, they were coming down. I didn't wait to see them. I bolted across the basement, knocking into a shelf that clattered loudly, and sprinted up the opposite set of stairs that led to a small door in the back. I had noticed it when I first looked around. I burst it open and ran out into the backyard. The cold air hit me like ice. I didn't look back. I jumped over a fallen fence, sprinted through the overgrown grass, and didn't stop until I saw my car. When I got inside and locked the doors, I looked at the house one last time. The front door was wide open now, the light from the pumpkin gone out completely. There was movement, just a shape near the porch standing still. I turned the key, floored the gas, and sped off without looking again. When I got home, I couldn't stop shaking. I kept thinking about that ID card, those footprints, and how recent everything had looked. I went online and searched the woman's name. The first result was a missing person report from 2 years ago. She had disappeared while traveling across the state, last seen renting a room through a local listing near my town. I never told anyone what happened that night. I don't even drive near that road anymore, but every Halloween, when the air starts getting cold and the streets fill with decorations again, I remember that smell, that sound of slow footsteps above me, and the thought that whoever lived or hunted in that house was still out there, waiting for someone else curious enough to stop. It was Halloween night and the air felt colder than it should have for late October. I wasn't planning to do anything special that evening. I didn't have any friends nearby and I wasn't really in the mood for decorations or candy. I just wanted a quiet night. My apartment was on the edge of a small town, right next to a stretch of woods that most people avoided after dark. They said homeless people sometimes stayed there, or that wild animals roamed through it at night. I didn't think much about it. I had lived there for a year, and nothing strange had ever happened. That night, around 6, the neighborhood kids were already running around in costumes, shouting and laughing. I turned off my porch light to make sure no one came knocking. I wasn't being mean, I just wanted silence. I heated some canned soup, ate while scrolling through my phone, and then decided to watch something on my laptop. But halfway through the movie, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, but enough to make me pause. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy along the gravel road that ran beside the woods. At first, I thought maybe it was someone moving trash cans or some late trick-or-treater pulling a wagon. But the dragging sound continued, slow and steady, for several minutes. Then it stopped right behind my apartment. My kitchen window faced that direction, and though I didn't want to, I went to look. The window glass was slightly fogged from the inside, and the yard light barely reached the tree line. I squinted, trying to see what was there. I could just make out a faint shape, a person, I thought, standing still. No flashlight, no movement, just standing. I couldn't tell if they were facing my window or looking toward the woods. The stillness of it was strange. I stood there for about 30 seconds, waiting for them to move or walk away, but they didn't. My heart started pounding because it didn't make sense. Then slowly, the shape bent down. I could hear the faint scrape again, like metal or something rough being dragged over stones. Then silence. I didn't want to look anymore. I stepped back from the window, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor dragging something home, maybe a trick of light. But the air in the apartment felt heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. A few minutes later, I heard another sound, this time softer. It came from the side of my building like slow footsteps brushing against the leaves. My stomach tightened. I didn't move. I just stood there listening. Then there was a quiet knock. Not on the door, on the side wall just below the kitchen window. A small, deliberate tap. Then again, I froze. I wanted to believe it was a branch or something hitting the siding, but there was no wind. The knocks came again, same rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap. My mouth went dry. I turned off all the lights and stood in the hallway holding my breath. I waited for a few minutes and the noise stopped. I tried to listen for footsteps, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator. After a while, I started to calm down, thinking maybe someone was just messing around because it was Halloween. About 20 minutes later, I realized I hadn't locked the small storage shed attached to the back of my apartment. It wasn't big, just a small wooden space for tools and a lawnmower. I thought maybe I should check it, just to make sure no one was hiding there. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the back door. The cold air hit me instantly. The yard was completely silent. The only light came from the weak yellow glow of a distant street lamp. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my feet sounding louder than it should have. I shined the light toward the shed. The door was closed, but something looked off. The handle was slightly bent downward like someone had tried to force it open. My pulse started to rise again. I stood there for a long time before I finally forced myself to walk closer. I reached the door, placed my hand on the handle, and felt that it was loose. I took a deep breath and pulled it open. The smell hit me first, wet earth and something metallic, maybe rust. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness and I saw that the inside had been disturbed. My shovel was leaning against the wall covered in fresh dirt. A piece of rope lay on the ground, frayed and stiff. And in the far corner there was a small patch of mud that looked freshly dug. My brain was trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had used it to dig something nearby. Maybe a raccoon had dragged the rope in. But deep down I knew it wasn't that. The dirt looked like it had been taken from a deeper hole. Someone had used that shovel recently. I backed away from the shed and turned off my flashlight for a second, trying to see if anyone was out there. That's when I noticed something else. Near the edge of the woods, there was another faint light, like a phone screen flickering for a few seconds, then going dark. It wasn't far from my fence line. Someone was still out there watching. I didn't go back inside right away. I stood in the cold for a while, trying to think. Then I finally locked the shed, went back in, and pushed a chair against the back door. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me flinch. The next morning, everything looked normal. No footprints, no disturbed gravel, no marks on the siding. The only sign that anything had happened was that same patch of disturbed dirt in the shed. I called the landlord later that day and told him about the shed handle being bent, but I didn't mention the rest. That night, I checked the shed again. The shovel was still there, but the dirt patch was different. It looked flattened, like someone had pressed it down with their hands. The rope was gone. I looked around outside again, and this time I noticed faint tracks near the tree line, boot prints going in both directions. A week later, the police came to the neighborhood. They went door to door asking questions about a missing person. A man had disappeared from a nearby town a few days before Halloween. They said his car was found on the other side of the woods, abandoned, keys still in the ignition. No one knew what happened to him. I never told them what I saw or what I found in my shed. I didn't want them digging around my property or thinking I had something to do with it. But I've thought about it every day since. It's been months now and I still live in the same place. I keep the shed locked with a heavy chain, and I never go near the woods after dark. Sometimes though, late at night I still hear that dragging sound, slow, steady, moving across the gravel. It always stops in the same place right behind my apartment. And every time it does, I lie still and wait for morning, wondering if one day they'll dig up that spot behind the shed and finally see what's really buried there. It was Halloween night, and I was alone in my small apartment on the edge of town. I had no plans, no friends coming over, and no kids to take trick-or-treating. It was one of those nights that felt heavier than usual. The streets outside were filled with laughter and noise earlier in the evening, but now it was past midnight. Everything had gone quiet except for the faint rustling of leaves outside and the occasional barking of a distant dog. The air felt colder than normal, sharp against my skin whenever I stepped near the drafty windows. I had turned off most of the lights to watch an old horror movie, trying to make the night pass quicker, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling that something about that night was off. Around 1 in the morning, I got hungry and decided to walk to the gas station 2 blocks away. I didn't like leaving my apartment at night, but I didn't have any food left except stale bread. The streets were empty now. Most houses had their lights off, and the decorations, plastic skeletons, fake cobwebs, pumpkins, looked different in the dark. They didn't look fun anymore. They looked like reminders of people who had gone inside and locked their doors. The only light came from the flickering orange street lamps, and even those seemed too dim. I remember hearing my own footsteps echo louder than they should have. The night air smelled like burnt leaves and damp soil. When I reached the gas station, the lights inside were harsh and cold. I grabbed a sandwich, a drink, and paid quickly. The clerk looked half asleep. I walked back the same way, cutting through the small alley between the convenience store and the old laundromat. I had done it before in daylight, but never at night. It saved me a few minutes. The alley was narrow and damp, the walls covered in faded graffiti and old posters curling at the edges. There was a faint humming sound, maybe from a nearby transformer, but otherwise it was silent. I started walking faster when I noticed something lying on the ground near the dumpster. It looked like a pumpkin, smashed open and half rotten, its seeds scattered across the concrete. As I walked past, I caught a glimpse of something else beside it, a small mask, the kind kids wear for trick-or-treating. It was a cheap plastic clown mask, cracked down the middle. It didn't seem like a big deal, but something about it made me stop. The way it was positioned, like someone had taken it off and set it carefully next to the broken pumpkin, didn't make sense. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at it, trying to understand why it bothered me so much. Then I heard a faint sound behind me, something like a shoe scraping the ground. I turned fast, but the alley was empty, just shadows and trash cans. The sound didn't come again, but it had been close, too close. I kept walking, a little faster now, gripping the plastic bag of food tighter. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. I reached the end of the alley and stepped back onto the street. The road was empty, but I thought I saw movement near the edge of the trees that lined the sidewalk. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a stray cat. When I finally got back to my apartment building, I checked behind me before unlocking the door. The street was still. Everything looked normal again. I went inside, locked the door, and turned on the kitchen light. The clock on the wall said 1:32 a.m. I tried to shake it off. I sat down and started eating, but I couldn't stop thinking about that mask. The image of it lying there, the crack down its face, stuck in my mind. After eating, I took out the trash and pushed it down the hall chute. I wanted to distract myself, so I turned the TV back on. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard something outside my apartment door. A soft thud, then another. I muted the TV and listened. It sounded like someone dragging something across the hallway floor. Not walking, not knocking, just a slow, uneven scraping. The kind of sound that makes your skin prickle. My building was mostly empty. Most tenants were older people who went to sleep early. I stood there, not moving, just staring at the door. The sound stopped after maybe 10 seconds. Then, just as I started to breathe again, I heard a small click, like something being dropped right outside. I waited a full minute before I moved closer and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by a single buzzing light. But on the floor, right in front of my door, was something small. I couldn't see it clearly through the peephole. I stood there debating if I should open the door. Against my better judgment, I did. I opened it slowly, just enough to see outside. There was no one there, just a small plastic bag, the kind used for candy, lying flat on the ground. Inside was that same cracked clown mask I had seen earlier in the alley. I stared at it for a long time. My stomach felt hollow. I picked it up carefully, holding it by the edge of the bag. It was the exact same mask, same crack, same dirt marks on the side. Someone had followed me back. I checked the hallway again, but it was still empty. I closed the door, locked it, and pushed a chair under the handle. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark for what felt like hours, listening for any sound. The night dragged on. Around 4 a.m., I started hearing faint footsteps in the stairwell. Slow, steady, one step at a time. I knew they were coming up to my floor because the creaks got louder. They stopped once they reached the top, then silence. I waited, barely breathing, my ears straining to pick up any noise. After a few minutes, I heard something slide across the floor again. Closer this time, right outside my door. I didn't look. I just sat there until I saw the faint light of morning through the window. When the sun finally rose, I opened the door carefully. The hallway was empty again. The plastic bag with the mask was gone, but there were small muddy footprints leading away from my door, heading toward the stairs. They were uneven, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one foot. I followed them halfway down the hall before stopping. The footprints went all the way to the back exit and disappeared outside. I moved out 2 days later. I didn't even tell the landlord why. I couldn't sleep there anymore. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like someone watching. I tried convincing myself it was a prank, maybe a kid from the neighborhood. But the way the mask was placed, the timing, the footsteps in the stairwell, it didn't feel random. It felt like someone had chosen me specifically that night. Even now, whenever Halloween comes around and I see those cheap plastic masks at the store, I feel that same chill in my stomach. I still don't know who followed me that night or why they left the mask at my door. But I do know one thing. I never walk alone on Halloween anymore, and I never take shortcuts through alleys again. It was Halloween night and the air felt heavier than usual. The neighborhood was filled with kids in costumes running between houses, their laughter echoing through the cold October air. I wasn't really into Halloween anymore. I had no plans, no costume, and no one to hang out with. My friends were either at parties or out of town. I just wanted to take a long walk to clear my head. There was something about quiet streets at night that helped me think. I left my house around 9:30 p.m., zipped up my hoodie, and started walking toward the older part of town where the houses were more spread out and the streetlights were dimmer. The air smelled like wet leaves and smoke from fire pits. Every house I passed had pumpkins on the porch, some half rotten, their carved faces sagging and dark inside. I kept walking past the laughter and the bright porches until I reached the last row of houses, where the sidewalks ended and the road turned into cracked pavement lined with trees. There was a chill in the air that made me pull my hands into my pockets. The sound of my footsteps was the only thing I could hear. I liked that quiet until I noticed something. A white sedan was parked on the side of the road up ahead, engine off, no lights. The windows were tinted dark. It wasn't unusual to see parked cars, but something about how it sat there made me uneasy. There were no houses close by, no driveway, no reason for anyone to park there. As I passed it, I tried not to look directly at it, but I noticed the faint shape of someone sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a head and shoulders. I kept walking, pretending not to notice, but my pace quickened. When I looked back after a few seconds, the car hadn't moved. I told myself not to overthink it. I kept going down the road until I reached the small wooded area that led to an old walking trail. The trail was barely visible in the dark, but I'd walked it before in daylight. It was narrow and went through the woods for about half a mile before looping back toward the main road. I figured I'd walk halfway in and turn around. It was cold, but the quiet felt calming again. The trail was covered in fallen leaves and they made soft crunching sounds under my shoes. The moonlight filtered through the branches just enough to see the path. I walked deeper until I couldn't see the streetlights behind me anymore. That's when I heard the sound of a car door shutting in the distance. It was faint, but it echoed enough to make me stop walking. I stood still, trying to listen. The woods were quiet again. I told myself it could have been a trick-or-treater getting dropped off somewhere or someone heading home. But then, about a minute later, I heard leaves crunching. Not mine and not close, but definitely from somewhere behind me. The sound stopped when I stopped. I waited, listening so hard that my ears felt like they were straining. I turned around slowly, but there was nothing there. The trail behind me was empty. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a deer. I started walking again, this time faster. The sound came back. Faint, but definitely footsteps. Not animal-like, just the slow, steady rhythm of someone stepping carefully. My heart started to race. I didn't want to break into a run and make it obvious I was scared, so I just kept walking faster until I reached the small clearing where the trees opened up. The moonlight hit the dirt there and I could see farther around me. I stopped again and turned around completely this time. That's when I saw it. A shadow of a figure standing far down the trail. It was too dark to see details, just the faint shape of a person, maybe 20 or 30 feet back. They weren't moving, just standing watching. I felt a rush of cold through my body. I turned and started walking fast, almost jogging now. My breathing got heavier. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. When I did, the figure was closer. Not running, just walking steadily in my direction, that was it. I started running full speed down the trail. The ground was uneven and I nearly slipped on the leaves, but I didn't stop. The sound behind me got louder, the clear, sharp steps of someone running now. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The trail finally curved toward the exit where the trees opened up to the road again. I could see the dim yellow glow of the nearest streetlight. I ran until my lungs burned, burst out of the woods, and didn't stop until I reached the street. When I turned around, the trail was empty. Nothing came out after me. I waited there, staring into the dark gap between the trees, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I told myself maybe it was someone messing around, a Halloween prank or something. I didn't want to believe otherwise. I started walking back toward home, keeping to the middle of the street where it was lit. When I reached the area where that white sedan had been parked earlier, it was gone. The spot was empty, but on the ground near where the tires had been, I saw something. Shoe prints in the soft dirt, leading from the roadside into the same trail I had just come from. The prints were fresh. I could see the clear pattern of the soles. I didn't stop walking. I just kept going until I reached my neighborhood. My hands were still shaking. Every sound, a rustle of leaves, a car passing by, made me flinch. I finally got back to my house and locked the door behind me. I tried to calm myself down, but I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet that figure had been until I noticed them. Whoever it was, they were careful. Too careful, and the way they just stood there waiting for me to notice before moving, that's what stuck with me the most. Later that night, when I finally looked out my window before bed, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Across the street, under the streetlight, there was a car parked, white with tinted windows. I stared at it for a long time, trying to see inside, but the glass was too dark. When I woke up the next morning, it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. No tire marks, no footprints, nothing. But I know what I saw. I know what followed me that night. It's been days since then, and I haven't taken another walk. Every time I hear a car slow down outside, I can't help but look out the window. Most times it's nothing. But last night, just before midnight, I thought I saw headlights reflecting off my front door for a few seconds, before they turned off. When I looked outside, there was no car, just the sound of leaves moving in the wind. I don't know who was in that car or what they wanted, but I know they followed me. And every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow standing still in the woods, waiting for me to turn around. It was Halloween night and I had no plans. Everyone I knew was out at parties or taking their kids trick-or-treating, but I wasn't in the mood for crowds or costumes. I had finished work late, grabbed a cheap frozen dinner, and decided to take a long drive through the outskirts of town to clear my head. It was something I often did when I needed to think. The roads outside the city always had this lonely, open feel to them, especially in late October when the trees were bare and the fields looked dead. The kind of emptiness that made you feel small but peaceful at the same time. The night air was cold and dry. The heater in my old Honda Civic made a faint rattling sound that got worse when I turned it up. I drove with one hand on the wheel, my other resting on the gear shift, watching the orange glow of the dashboard lights against the black road ahead. Most houses I passed were dark except for a few with fake spider webs and dim porch lights still on for the last few trick-or-treaters. After about 20 minutes, the houses thinned out, and the road turned into long stretches of farmland and patches of forest. There were no streetlights, only my headlights cutting through the darkness and catching bits of fog drifting low along the ground. I wasn't planning to go far, but I took a random turn down a narrow road I'd never been on before. The GPS showed nothing but empty space. It was one of those old rural roads with cracked pavement, almost no shoulder, and thick trees pressing in close on both sides. I rolled down the window a bit. The air smelled damp and earthy, like decaying leaves. I could hear the hum of my tires on the road and the occasional rustle of branches brushing against the roof. A few miles down, I saw what looked like an old farmhouse off to the right. There were no lights, no cars, just a dark structure with a sagging porch and a barn behind it. The mailbox out front was half broken, the paint chipped away, but there was something hanging from it, a small jack-o'-lantern bucket, the kind kids use for candy. It swung lightly in the wind. For some reason, that sight made me stop. It was strange to see something festive out there, miles from any neighborhood. I pulled over, my headlights cutting across the front of the house. The windows were boarded up. The paint had peeled so much the wood underneath looked gray. The place had probably been empty for years, but that little orange bucket looked almost new, plastic shining under the light. I sat there staring at it for a while, trying to figure out why it bothered me so much. Then I noticed something else. The grass near the mailbox looked flattened, like someone had been standing there recently. Not just once either. It looked like there were several overlapping marks, as if someone had paced back and forth. I turned off the engine to listen. The silence was complete. No crickets, no wind, nothing. The air felt heavy, pressing against my ears. I told myself it was probably just a farmer's old property. Maybe the bucket was left by some kid last year. Still, something about the place pulled at me. I got out of the car. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the mailbox. The air was colder outside, sharp and dry in my lungs. The bucket had a few pieces of candy inside, still wrapped but old-looking. The kind of hard candy that sticks together over time. As I turned to go back, my eyes caught something faintly shining in the grass near the ditch. I moved closer and crouched down. It was a small silver keychain flashlight, the kind you clip to a bag. I picked it up and pressed the button. It still worked, casting a thin beam of white light. It wasn't dusty or rusty. It looked like it had been dropped recently. That was when I felt it, the strange low vibration in the ground. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then I realized it was coming from down the road. I stood still, listening. It was a dull, heavy thudding sound, like footsteps, but far too rhythmic, too slow. It stopped suddenly and the silence returned. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. But the sound hadn't come from the woods, it had come from the road. I got back into my car quickly and started the engine. The headlights lit up the road ahead again, but this time I saw movement. Someone was standing at the far edge of the beam about 50 feet away. A person. At first I thought it was a scarecrow because they weren't moving. Just standing there facing my car. They were wearing dark clothes, maybe a jacket, and something in their hand. Something long like a stick or tool. I couldn't see their face clearly because of the glare, but I knew they were staring at me. I froze. My first instinct was to back up and turn around, but the road was too narrow. I flicked on my high beams, hoping they'd move or I'd see who it was. But the second the bright light hit them, they turned and started walking away down the road. Slow and steady, not running. The sound of their boots on the pavement echoed faintly. I waited until they were almost gone, then I drove forward slowly, keeping a safe distance. They eventually turned off the road and disappeared behind the trees. I kept driving, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The road stretched on for another few miles before I finally hit an intersection that led back to the highway. I didn't look back once. When I got home that night, I parked in my driveway and sat there for a few minutes, engine off, trying to process what happened. I still had that small flashlight in my jacket pocket. It felt strange to bring it inside, but I did anyway. I left it on my kitchen counter. The next morning, I woke up and saw dirt on my kitchen floor. It was faint, like dried mud from a shoe. There were small prints leading from the back door to the counter where I had set the flashlight. The door was locked just like I had left it. I checked every window, every lock. Nothing was broken. The flashlight was gone. That day I drove back out toward the road, but I couldn't find it again. It wasn't on the GPS anymore. I drove the same direction for almost an hour, but the road with the farmhouse and mailbox just wasn't there. The land all looked different. Newer fences, no old buildings. I don't go driving on Halloween anymore. I don't even leave the porch light on, because somewhere out there, on a road I can't find again, someone was walking toward my car holding something long in their hand, watching me from the dark. And whoever they were, they found their way to my house. It was Halloween night, cold and quiet, the kind of night that made the air feel heavy and still. I hadn't planned to do anything that evening. I wasn't into parties or costumes. I just wanted to spend it alone, maybe watch a movie or two and call it a night. But around 8, I got bored. I went out for a drive. The streets were filled with kids running around in cheap plastic masks, parents following behind them with flashlights. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just wanted to drive until my head cleared. After about 20 minutes, I turned off the main road and started heading toward the outskirts of town. There was an old part of the neighborhood I hadn't seen in years, where the houses sat far apart and most of them looked empty. I used to ride my bike through there as a kid, but it always gave me an odd feeling. Too quiet, too still. The kind of place where even the wind seemed to avoid moving. As I drove deeper, the streetlights got fewer and fewer, until it was just my headlights cutting through the darkness. I passed one house that looked completely abandoned, broken, porch steps, windows covered in boards, grass high enough to hide a small animal. I slowed down for a second, then kept going. Something about that house made me feel like it had been forgotten for a reason. A few minutes later, I saw a small shape up ahead on the side of the road. I thought it was an animal at first, but when I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man. He was standing near a ditch facing the woods. He wasn't wearing a costume, just dark clothes and a hood pulled over his head. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. But I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw him turn his head toward me as I passed. I don't know why that bothered me, but it did. I tried to shake it off and kept driving until I reached a dead end. I pulled over, turned off the car, and sat for a moment. The silence was thick. No cars, no wind, no distant laughter from trick-or-treaters. Just the ticking of my engine cooling down. I started to feel uneasy sitting there like I was being watched. I told myself it was just the setting. Dark road, Halloween, old neighborhood. But it didn't help. I decided to turn back. As I started driving, I noticed something strange. A car I hadn't seen earlier was parked a few blocks down, lights off, engine running. I could see a faint glow on the inside, maybe from a phone screen or dashboard light. When I passed, I looked at the driver's seat. There was someone sitting there. I couldn't make out the face, but they were looking directly at me. I felt a tightness in my chest. It could have been nothing. Maybe someone waiting for someone else. Maybe a delivery driver or someone lost. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. As I turned onto the main road, I checked my mirror again. The car was moving. It pulled out slowly and started following me. I tried not to panic. I told myself it was just a coincidence. I made a few random turns. Left, right, then another right. The car did the same each time. By the time I reached the residential area again, my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The car stayed several lengths behind me, far enough that I couldn't see the driver clearly, but close enough that I knew it was following. I drove past the same groups of trick-or-treaters, slowing down for them to cross. I hoped whoever was in that car would stop or turn off somewhere once we got back into a busier area. They didn't. I turned onto my street and pulled into my driveway. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to act normal. I sat there in the car for a few seconds, pretending to check my phone, pretending I didn't notice the other car stop at the corner of the street. It idled there, engine humming softly. No one got out. I waited. After what felt like a full minute, I got out and locked my car. I walked quickly to my front door without looking back. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and turned off all the lights except one lamp in the living room. My plan was to sit quietly and see if the car left. I peeked through the blinds. The car was still there, parked halfway down the street. Headlights off now. I could barely see the outline of it, but I knew it hadn't moved. I sat there watching for a while. My street was quiet. Most houses dark except for a few with Halloween decorations still glowing faintly. Fake cobwebs, orange lights, a plastic skeleton swinging in the wind. An hour passed. The car didn't move. I started to wonder if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe it wasn't even the same car. But just as I was starting to calm down, I saw the faint glint of a reflection. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out. The streetlight didn't reach that far, so I could only make out the shape. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes, maybe the same man I saw earlier by the ditch. He didn't move for a moment, just stood there facing my direction. Then he started walking. Slowly, I backed away from the window. I didn't want him to see me. I killed the lamp and sat on the floor in the dark. My heart was hammering. Every sound felt amplified. The ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, my own breathing. I tried to listen for footsteps, but everything outside was silent. Minutes passed, then faintly I heard something. A crunch of gravel near the driveway. He was close. I stayed low, barely breathing. There was a creak. My porch steps. Then nothing. Total silence. I sat there frozen for what felt like forever. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to know where he was. My mind was racing. Maybe he was checking doors. Maybe he was just standing there. I waited until I couldn't take it anymore. I crawled slowly toward the window and lifted one side of the blind just a bit. The street was empty. The car was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with every light on until the sun came up. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, I noticed footprints on the wet leaves near my porch. They led up to my front steps and stopped at the door. The police came later that day after I called, but there wasn't much they could do. They told me it was probably someone trying to scare people on Halloween. Maybe just a prank. But it didn't feel like a prank. For the next few nights, I couldn't relax. I'd wake up every few hours and check the window. On the third night, I found something small stuck under my windshield wiper. A folded piece of paper. No message, no writing, just a Polaroid picture. It was a photo of my house taken from across the street. My front door was open in the picture, but I never opened it that night.